always come with a little bit of an economic health.
Recording is on.
Oh, good. I usually come with a little bit of a health warning among economists, because I am different from most other economists in as much as I don't want a career as an economist. I sort of hide away in academia. So before we start, you need to understand the difference in terms of economics between right, centre and left. And an economist would think of those in terms of the percentage of national income that government spends on your behalf. So if government spent nothing at all, the sort of anarchy on the right there, we would be as far right as you could possibly go with no government doing anything. The centre, as far as I'm concerned, yeah.
Sorry, you haven't moved your slides along. We're not seeing slide 2 that you're talking about.
Oh, right. So you're still on this, are you?
We're still at the beginning, yeah.
Right. Well, my screen says sharing there. Shall I go out and share it? Start.
I think you might need to manually click on number 2 in your presentation application.
Oh, right. So it doesn't move on your screen. Oh, that's a nuisance, isn't it? Sorry, let me. If it's there, are you seeing it there?
Right, that's it. No, go back.
So you can see that one moving on.
Yeah.
So I won't go to the slideshow, then I'll just work with this. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. So you can see this screen now, hopefully,
yes,
with right, centre, left on it. We've explained where the right is. The centre for me would be where about 25% of national income is spent by government. And then the left is 50% or more as you move across on the middle of that screen. Now, unfortunately, all UK politics fits in a little band left of centre, which you can see here, where you've got left and right. And it's really a mixture. All political parties are saying slightly different things, but doing exactly the same things. And in terms of the last 60 or 70 years, I would think probably the best socialist prime minister was probably Ted Heath. And the best Tory Prime Minister after Margaret Thatcher, of course, was probably Tony Blair. So it's a great mixture here, politics. Now, I'm here. I'm far right of centre. And economists which want employment sort of fit into here, want governments to intervene a lot. So you have the Keynesians, you have modern monetary theorists, you have Minskyites, and they're moving towards the sort of socialism and the communism extreme as you move left. Whereas I am here with the monetarists and Austrians, with capitalism sitting underneath me. So that's the position that I hold as an academic and as an economist. So you can see that I would never really be employed or even listened to by a political party, because I'm not over in this particular part here. A thought before we start. John Maynard Keynes, the Keynesians get most of what Keynes said incorrectly, but Keynes himself was actually a good economist, and he said the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they're right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. The important word there is wrong. Karl Marx was an economist, and you can see that probably he destroyed 2 generations of people, and his ideals probably murdered more than 50 or 60 million people. So you can see how powerful ideas are, and particularly the ideas of economists, not only when they're right, but when they're wrong. And so I very much would like to get the arguments clear in people's minds as to what is right rather than what is wrong. So we start money. Nice simple definition for you. When you want to go to impress people, particularly at parties, and they ask you what money is, you'll say this. It's the definition from Francis Walker back in the 19th century. He said it's that which passes freely from hand to hand in full payment for goods, in final discharge of indebtedness, which is exactly what happens. You hand some money over, someone hands you a product, and the debt is discharged. It's accepted equally without reference to the character or credit of the person who holds this money, and without the intention on the part of the person receiving it to consume it, to enjoy it, or otherwise use it, than by passing it on sooner or later in exchange. That's what money is. Now, one thing I want to get clear in your mind, so there's no confusion, is what the demand for money means, because quite often demand for money, demand for loans are thrown together. They're not. Demand for money is something very specific. Your money is your wealth, despite what has been said. But money you borrow from other people is not your wealth. Now, you hold a proportion of your wealth in money because you want to carry out transactions with that money. You hold a little bit extra as a precaution, just in case you need more. And you may even demand money for speculation. A lot of confusion about that. People think they're speculating with money when they buy shares and assets and look for their change in price. That's not speculative demand for money. Speculative demand for money is actually holding money in anticipation that it will go up in value. Now, probably in your lifetimes, you would never have seen that because it requires deflation to take place before you can speculate by holding money. Let me give a very simple example of what I mean by this. You remember when you were young and at Christmas, mum and dad said to you, what do you want for Christmas? And because of your nous in this area, you said, I'll have the money, please. And the reason you said, I'll have the money, please, is that you knew that money would be worth more in January when you could buy exactly the present you wanted and have some money left over from the sales, and you can buy other things. That's you speculating with money. That's the speculative demand for money. So never confuse demanding money, which is you holding your own assets in the form of money, and the demand for loans, which is you wanting to borrow somebody else's money. So having got that hopefully clear in your mind, I'm going to take you through 5 steps to money hell, where we are at present. The first 3 are actually not almost money heaven, but the last 2 unfortunately take us to money hell. The first takes us back prehistory, hunter-gatherer society, and then we're going to look at goldsmiths and the unofficial gold standard. We're then going to go to the 1844 Bank Charter Act, which is significant, the suspension of the gold standard, and then the final closing down of the gold exchange standard when the full fiat currency and all the problems that you're now beginning to notice. So let me just take you through each of those steps. If I lived in a cave, prehistory of course, in this hunter-gatherer society, I'm the hunter. In the next cave, one of those vegetarians, so he's a gatherer, so he goes out and collects vegetables. Now, I'm a meat and 2 veg man, so I want to trade my animal skin for some vegetables, but my animal skin is worth much more than the vegetables I currently require. So I say to him, look, I'll have some of that salt as well. Now, I don't want that salt. I've got loads of salt. I don't want it, but I know everyone else wants it. It's generally acceptable. And so that salt is now money. I'm going to hold on to that salt. I don't want it, but I'm going to pass it on sooner or later to somebody else in exchange. So that's where money comes from. It's just whatever these early forms were. Animal hides in some societies, salt. In the southern hemisphere, cowrie shells were used, decorative shells that people wanted. Newfoundland, it was dried cod, if you can imagine carrying that around in your wallet. Virginia, it was tobacco, sugar in the West Indies. So there are lots of commodity-based forms of money. That is you trading something that you don't want to use in any other way than to pass it on to somebody else sooner or later in exchange. That's what the early forms of money were. Now we're going to jump right the way through to the 17th century now, and we're going to look at the impact that goldsmiths had. These were Jewish emigres from Eastern Europe who came to London, East End of London, to avoid persecution, and they were mainly jewellers, and of course jewellers have vaults. And unlucky for them, in 1640, Charles I, he raided the Royal Mint's gold, which meant that people who had gold at the Royal Mint were quite upset. There was an English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. Goldsmiths weren't selling much of their jewellery, but they did have vaults, so they could make money by being depositories for gold. They could look after people's gold. The rich people would then put their money with the goldsmiths, and the goldsmiths would give them a paper receipt to show that they owed that gold. Now, that paper receipt actually becomes money, because what happens is you've put your money with the goldsmith, you've got the paper receipt, and you want to buy something. You could go to the goldsmith, get the gold out, take it to the mint it, and pay that way. Or you could just hand the receipt and say, I own this gold, I'm now passing it over so that you own this gold, and trade it for a property or whatever it is you want to trade it for. And goldsmiths, realizing that there were opportunities here, would have given receipts with lots of different denominations. You know, you put £100 in there, they might give you 9 £10 receipts, 1 £5 receipts, and 5 £1 receipts. So these things were passed around as money. So these were the earliest forms of paper money in the UK economy. In my example, there's lots of other things in between, but this is the second significant thing, because out of this comes the beginning of what money really is. Because step 2 is when goldsmiths, working as I describe, turn themselves into bankers, because what happens is that people are quite happy to use goldsmiths' receipts as money, and goldsmiths are sitting on lots of gold that's never used, and there are always people out there who want to borrow money, governments particularly, and they decide that they can quite sensibly lend out a small proportion of this gold. And when they lend out this gold, they can offer the gold, so people can actually take the gold away, or they can offer a receipt for the gold. And because these receipts have been going around, everyone accepts them as money. People say, no, it's all right, I don't want the gold. I'll just have the receipt to say that I own the gold. And at that point, you've actually started to create more receipts in circulation than there is actually gold in the vaults. You've now started through the banking process to create new money. So you're now making new money at this point in time. The goldsmiths know that if they overdo this, there might be a problem, lending and lending and lending, because every day someone might want to come and look at their gold or take some gold out. So they've got to make sure they keep a significant proportion of gold just in case. And as long as people have confidence, then you've now got a situation where paper money is expanding, which is what trade requires, through a fairly natural process, no government or anyone else involved at this stage. And so you've got a situation now where goldsmiths, as bankers, created new money. And before they made any loans, every note in circulation was 100% backed by gold. As soon as they become bankers, it isn't. And goldsmiths will see, my word, this is a lucrative business, much better than being a jeweler. So once a banker, the goldsmiths will thereafter remain bankers. And obviously, many of the banks that you look at in London of long standing will have the names associated with the goldsmiths that originally set them up. So that's step 2. We've now created new money as soon as these goldsmiths become bankers. Now, step 3, the Bank Charter Act of 1844, because governments go, that's not a bad idea, that, is it? We can get in here and do a few things, because they hadn't been doing anything up to them. And in 1844, Robert Peel passed the Bank Charter Act, which gave the government's bank, the Bank of England, a monopoly over the printing of notes. And they printed notes which were backed by gold at the Bank of England, but the government also allowed them a fiduciary issue, an issue in excess of the amount of gold they've got of £14 billion. And how do we get that into the economy? Well, Robert Peel said, I've got a great idea, I can spend it. So you can see how governments are quite attracted by this idea of being able to create new money. At the same time, other banks are still making loans. And so the money supply is now expanding, is fractionally backed by gold, but it expands at a fairly slow rate, which is quite good because the economy is growing at a fairly slow rate. And money is therefore lubricating, facilitating the circulation of trade. So we've got an official gold standard, but governments realise that they can do lots of things, and they often get into wars, don't they? So in 1914, they financed the First World War with printed money. You could tax people, you could borrow money from people, much quicker to print money and draw resources towards a war effort. And when the government prints that money, then it's got a problem because there's now too many notes in circulation relative to the gold that's backing it. So they have to suspend the gold standard, which is exactly what they do. They have their war, and then after the war, they've got a problem, and this is where the Bank of England makes an enormous error. The Cunliffe Committee said to it, you need to return to the pre-war gold standard. That's with a certain amount of notes in circulation relative to the gold that you've got. Wars didn't create any more gold. So the only way you can do that is destroy money. So they budgeted for surpluses and actually destroyed money. It took them until 1925 before they could return to the gold standard, and they caused a decade of enormous problems in the UK. As you can see, if you watch Peaky Blinders or programs like that, it wasn't a particularly good time. Deflation's never good for anybody, but it's actually a great period of time just after the First World War, because we had deflation because we destroyed money. Germany had hyperinflation because it printed loads of it. America had the Roaring Twenties, the Great Gatsby, the Scott Fitzgerald, because they did things reasonably sensibly, but unfortunately, the Federal Reserve got it all wrong after the Wall Street crash, and it went down the same deflationary route and destroyed money, or allowed money to be destroyed, and you had what really was the precursor to a Second World War. Now, we weren't quite out of the limits that gold gives you on money creation, because straight after the Second World War, Bretton Woods, we set up the gold exchange standard, which means you poor ordinary people can now no longer get your gold. So your notes mean nothing to you other than you can buy things with them. You can't get any gold with them, but officially governments can. They can transfer gold between them to settle inter-country debts, and the whole system was supported by Fort Knox. Those of you who've seen the James Bond film Goldfinger will know all about Fort Knox. Exchange rates were fixed, and surpluses and deficits on the current account of the balance of payments would be settled by gold being transferred from one country to another, and economies reflating, expanding and contracting the amount of money that they have in circulation. However, you've still got governments involved here, and America, of course, have realized that governments can create lots of money, particularly as they are the main currency. And they've got wars as well. So they've got the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and they print too many dollars. So the gold exchange standard collapses in 1971, and we now have our problem. We have fully fiat currencies from 1971, which means that money can be created at will by central banks and treasuries governments. Now that means we need the economists now to tell us what to do, don't we? And the Keynesians go wild in the 1970s in the UK, particularly. They targeted 5% growth, no inflation, higher employment, and they ended up for a decade getting no growth. Instead of 5%, they got an average of 0.6%. They got inflation up to just under 30%, and they got unemployment rising. It was the first really good example of stagflation. The Keynesians then were forgotten about when you get into the 80s because they got it all wrong. It just does not work creating currency in a willy-nilly way. But when we have the global financial crisis, 2006-07, then there's the worry about deflation, and the Keynesians get a second chance. And at a G20 meeting in London in March of 2009, all countries agreed to have fiscal expansions, fiscal deficits, run budget deficits, expand their economies, and give it another go. That's what Keynesian economics is all about. And of course, that didn't work either. So you're looking for someone, a theory that can tell you that governments can spend lots of money without really having any responsibility and not having to raise taxes and not having to officially borrow money, because votes come from spending money. They don't come from telling people that they've got to finance that expenditure. So we get the birth of modern monetary theory. Now, modern monetary theory, the culprits here, you're looking at Stephanie Kelton, Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell, Randall Wray, and I've listed all their mistakes in a lecture and in an article, one of my YouTube lectures and an article on my blog explaining why they've got it all wrong. I've often had little arguments, particularly Warren Mosler on Twitter, but he very quickly runs away from these arguments, as do many people who try and put forward the modern monetary theory explanation. Stephanie Kelton wrote The Deficit Myth, which is absolutely wrong, because the deficit is a very important thing you need to be very careful with. There is no deficit myth, but she managed to explain the deficit myth and it also explained that all inflations for the last 100 years were cost push inflations. And if you've ever read an economics textbook, you'll know that there are demand pull and cost push causes of inflation. If you read any of my articles, and you can listen again to my lectures on YouTube, I explain to you that cost push is an absolute myth. Cost push does not cause inflation. Higher oil prices, higher wages, higher commodity prices, a falling exchange rate. Don't listen to the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the ECB. None of those things can cause inflation. They can change relative prices, some go up, some go down, but inflation by definition is more units of money used in the same number of transactions. Yeah. So you've always got to ask, where do more units of money come from? They must come from your central bank. Central banks cause inflation, no one else causes inflation, and there is no such thing as cost push inflation, which unfortunately means Stephanie Kelton's book is almost all wrong. The natural rate of interest should be zero, says modern monetary theory, because we can pump as much money into the economy as you like to bring down interest rates to zero. As we know, an economy is very unbalanced and doesn't work with zero rates, as we have noticed for quite a long time now, at least the last decade, because we dropped interest or bank rate, government's official interest rate, from 5.75 all the way down to, we're now at 0.1%. And you can see bubbles, lots of problems with that. It's not a natural rate of interest to be at zero. I suspect the natural rate of interest is the market rate of interest for borrowing, which is probably 4 or 5 or even 6% at the bottom secured end. Now, the other mistake modern monetary theorists make is they say government spending creates new money. And taxation destroys money. That's totally wrong. Government spending doesn't create new money, and taxing doesn't destroy that money. That money was all in circulation beforehand, and it's all the incomes of the private sector. Government has to take that income away, and all government spending is actually financed by the taxpayer currently or in the future, and we do pass on our debts to the next generation. Please don't tell them because they're going to be worse off as the result of what they do. And then a little bit of a tangent, Bill Mitchell talks about the Job Guarantee Scheme, which is a scheme that won't work. I explain why that won't work again on my blog, and I give you an alternative if you want to deal with low incomes and poverty, and that's called reverse income tax, but you would have to read about that on my blog. No time for that one. Now, the real deception here, just so that you're clear, both Keynesian and modern monetary theorists are able to complete this deception. The deception is I can spend money I print now, and it won't really affect the economy for 1 or 2 years, by which time I can tell you, no, that's cost push inflation, nothing to do with what I did. So when the government spends money now, it can enrich people now, it can employ people, it can support all manner of good causes, and you pay for it next year, because next year you get the inflation, you get the distorted markets, you get the damaged market signals, you get increased waste, you get stagflation, and you destroy growth. That's exactly what happened in the 70s, and it's just about to happen again now, unfortunately. I will explain why. Let me give you a very good theory of money, and it's a nice simple one. It's the best theory of money. It's the quantity theory of money, Irving Fisher's quantity theory, and it's MV equals PT, where M is the money stock. I can go out and measure that today. It's the amount of cash in the system, add up all the current accounts. It's everything available for people to use today to spend money. That's the money stock. V is the speed, the velocity it goes round in the economy. And M times V gives you your monetary demand. And that's exactly equal to real national income. The P is the average price, T is the number of transactions. So MV equals PT. Now, if we want to just drop down there and look at the pandemic, what did the pandemic do? It brought all manner of silly monetary expansions for producing nothing. So stock of money, M, was a big plus, but it told you all to stay at home. It locked you all in, so V went down. So monetary demand is only changed very slowly, and that's meant that inflation at the moment is very low and bank rate is almost zero. Now, when we return to normality, we've got plus M, and we're all going to go out spending lots of money, plus V. By the end of this year, inflation will be rising and bank rate will be pulled up because of our return to normality. You put the money in there, it's going to work its way through in the form of inflation. So has government money had its day? You're going to see a pandemic stagflation coming. The weakness of all the currencies around the world has led to a rise of cryptocurrencies, because people see opportunities for cryptocurrencies, a world currency, to replace what will be damaged domestic currencies. But central banks will come back with their own digital currencies, and I actually don't see a future for cryptocurrencies. My apologies for anyone sitting there thinking that it's a great thing. And last night when I spoke to Chris and Kevin, Chris wanted to know what happens next. So if you've listened to what I said and you're all sitting there with loads of money thinking, what should I do with it? Don't speculate by holding on to money. I told you what speculation is. It's deflation, a fall in prices and increase in the value. You won't get that. So don't speculate by holding money. Don't hold on to cryptos long term. Short term's okay, because people are misled into thinking that they will have value in the future. They won't. So cryptos will eventually disappear. You need to go out there and buy real things. You need to be into investment rather than savings, which is a bit difficult because you are putting your capital at risk, whereas savings don't do that, but you can't earn anything from that. You need a diversified portfolio, at least 5 to 10 good assets in this portfolio, and you probably need to, for your pension, to look to property rather than your pension scheme, which won't be earning anything, and build up something which will provide you rent at the time that you retire. And then there's just, and you can get this, there's a list there of my blog titles, which you could read, and my YouTube lectures, which you can listen to. And those are all the addresses. If you go to my blog, it's that address you want. If you want to join me on Twitter, it's that. If you want to listen, there are 2 lots of lectures on YouTube, free, which one is an introduction to economics, 10 lectures. The other is an introduction to banking and finance, 10 lectures. And then there's some miscellaneous higher level lectures of applied economics. That's the end. If you're still awake, Kevin?
I am.
You are.
I am.
So if I stop sharing now, hopefully that'll be the right thing, won't it?
Yeah.
And I come back to you.
We should see your handsome face. There you are.
You've got me. Right, there you go. That's it. I'm sorry if I spent too much time, but...
No, that's fine. You're actually near enough spot on 30 minutes, so
am I? Oh,
can't
good.
grumble.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that.
Pleasure.
I can't say I understood all of it, but thank you very much. Has anybody got...
I say
Sorry,
you,
go on.
you can go to the blog and just develop the point a little bit further. They're all there in one form or another. But sorry, I'll leave it to you, Kevin.
Okay. John is going to send me the slides. So once I've got them, I'll make them into some kind of presentation format, maybe an MP4 or something that you can just download and go over your heart's content until you understand it, or obviously in conjunction with John's blog and YouTube channel. Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask?
Yeah.
You know, when I said put your hands up, I meant the little thing on the screen. But as you've all done it at once, Chris.
Oh, thank you. My question is, John, why is it you think that governments keep repeating the same mistakes over and over?
It's because what they want is to be told things that will get them votes. And Keynesian economics told them a way that they could get votes by spending money and not taxing people. There was a downside to Keynesian economics because there was Keynes wanted you to run budget deficits and budget surpluses, and budget surpluses are no good for votes. We like budget deficits. So Keynesians came along and said, no, you can go with bigger budget deficits and smaller budget deficits. And that's what politicians want to hear. Except when it falls apart, they want to sort of distance themselves, but they really need people to tell them things that will get them votes. And that's where modern monetary theory is now telling them things that they can spend more money without doing anything. If they do what I tell them, then they've got to balance their budget. So straight away, I need taxes to come up and I need government spending to go down. And I need interest rates, bank rate, I need up by at least 2% above the inflation rate. I go up to 4% now. Imagine what that's going to do, this sort of rebalancing of the economy. No politician would want to listen to that. That's actually what you've got to do if you want to get out of the problems that we're in. But we will just continue with the problems because politicians are going to ignore. I'm way out, I'm far right, way out of centre field. And remember, all politicians are slightly centre left. So that's it. They wouldn't listen to me. But, academics will listen and argue. So that's the area, the only area I think where we'll be able to move forward. But as a political party, it's going to be very difficult to support the sort of arguments that I've given you and think that anyone will listen to you because you're not telling people what.
Didn't Thatcher, when Thatcher took over in 79-80,
yeah,
she kind of took the catastrophe that was the 70s,
yeah,
and effectively moved then towards free market economics as best she could within the limits she was imposed on.
Yeah,
and she was the most successful prime minister for a generation.
Yeah.
So I don't understand why politicians don't see Mrs. Thatcher's success with those types of policies and then try to emulate them, because it seemed, she had three general election victories, and why wouldn't a group of politicians want to emulate 3 general election victories by following similar policies?
Yeah, something preceded Mrs. Thatcher, which actually helped her a great deal, and that was that we ran out of money. Dennis Healy, I don't know if you remember him rushing back from the airport because we'd run out of money, and we needed to borrow money from the IMF, and the IMF said, you've got to cut your budget deficit, and we halved it to get this money. Now, politicians could say, we don't want to do this. Someone is forcing us to do this. And that was the start of an improvement. So it was Callaghan and Healy that got things moving in the right direction. Margaret Thatcher took over, tried to sort of follow monetarist ideals, did it a little bit. The good thing she did was go into free markets, fight the unions, and probably the only reason she got a second term, unfortunately, was the Falklands. By her second terms, things were looking better. And I will say she's been the best Prime Minister for the last 100 years. Not that that means much in terms of all the Prime Ministers, but certainly she was the best of that time. But you have to see what she did within the context of some other things that were around her that actually helped her at the time.
Thank you.
Peter.
It's just kind of sorry if I sound like a bit too much like a layman, because obviously I'm not like economically
that's
like completely economically.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering, like, I've been looking at like kind of examples, especially within our party, about how we could maybe like kind of like approach tax moving forward. And I don't think you obviously haven't really got the time now, I think, to fully go into it. But I was wondering if, because, for example, I think we stand on the idea that, for example, an income tax is morally wrong, because obviously it's a tax on a man's own production or like a woman's own production.
Yeah.
So I don't think like kind of, because I think you said something about a reverse income tax, which I presume is similar in a way to, for example, Friedman's negative income tax.
Correct. Yeah. Correct.
Yeah. But I was just wondering on if you could maybe say something like a couple of short, maybe like something short about it, or maybe if you get the time, you could maybe put something that like together on a land value tax as opposed to an income tax, and how that might potentially be worse or better.
Yeah, I'll tell you straight away. Worse.
Okay.
Yeah, what you want as far as taxes are concerned is income taxes, value-added tax, excise duty, nothing else. So I wouldn't have any corporate taxes, I wouldn't have any business taxes, I'd have nothing other than income taxes, and I'd have 3 bands. That's the reverse income tax band, and then perhaps 15% and 25% at various levels of income. I would have VAT as a source of income, and I would add excise duties, so I could add a little bit more to VAT to deal with those items that one might judge to be demerit goods, like gambling or smoking, where you could just add that little bit more on, or where there's a damaging effect on the environment or whatever. But I would do it all. If you start taxing wealth, and land taxes are a tax on wealth, you immediately destroy the source of the income. And the thing to do is always think of wealth as like a lake. If you start taking water out of it, it's eventually empty. Whereas you think of income as a stream, it's flowing by all the time. And if you can take a little bit of that away, there's always more coming behind. So the sensible, sustainable, long-term taxation policy, as I see it, and it would still fit in with your principles as a party, which is to do minimal taxation, if you like. Effectively, tax is to tax income and to tax spending. And at the end of the day, forget about wealth taxes. I mean, who wants to be living in a great big castle with all those heating bills and everything else? It's a real headache having loads of money. So I would not bother with a wealth tax at all. And land value taxes work a little bit through local authorities. So local authorities might want to sort of tax people in terms of their properties. So there is a little bit of that around.
And sorry, just to jump in, what I've been looking at recently is, I mean, obviously you will know, but the Henry George, the Georgists, that school of thought, and it was based on the idea that you do not tax any improvements that someone, for example, makes on their land. Like what they do with that land is entirely up to them, and you cannot touch that.
Yeah.
You simply charge them as for example, a community to hold that land to then do with as they please, or is that what you're talking about? Am I just not understanding?
No, what I'm really saying is what happens rather than what I would like to see happen.
Okay.
As I say, I'm quite happy for all taxes just to fit into this category, if you like, which doesn't look damaging to the economy. For example, one of the difficult things I have is to explain to people that if you bring corporation tax down to 0, you will increase tax revenues enormously. And everyone goes, well, how can you do that? Tax is 0. And of course, how you do that is, if we do that first, we'll be attracting loads of firms to come to Britain. It'll expand employment. People will be paying more taxes. There'll be more spending taxes. Corporation tax doesn't raise much in the way of income relative to, the big ones, spending tax, VAT, excise duties, and income tax. So I just stick with those, and we would fly as a country. But of course, again, not good politics, because politics, you want to find people, find sources of revenue that aren't people, because people do the voting. So I want to tax people who don't quite see it as them paying it. That's the problem. So sorry, I've given you something else to think about, but again,
no, absolutely.
It is on the blog as well in various ways that you can listen to if you wish.
I certainly will. Thank you very, very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks, John. Okay, Adam.
Just near the end there, you mentioned that interest rates will eventually have to rise. But as soon as interest rates rise, then all of these companies that are sustained through the extra liquidity that's created, then we're going to have to face that inevitable crash. And do you think they're ever actually going to allow rates to rise again and take that hit? Because obviously we've just had all of these lockdowns and whatnot. We've had like a year of sort of economic suspension. There's a lot of companies that should really be going under, but they're just sustained by this 0 rate. And then if we get out the backside of these lockdowns and whatnot, and then they allow rates to rise, then we're just straight back into another crash. But if they don't allow rates to rise, then we continue to run prices up and create bigger asset bubbles and whatnot. So which course do we take?
Good. Good question, because I argued, and the Bank of England was going along with me for a short period of time back around 2012, 13, 14, that interest rates have got to go up fairly quickly to rebalance the economy, and they even said they would put them up. But no country could do it on their own. And I was actually at the Bank of England with Draghi and Carney, and I tried to suggest that central banks should all raise interest rates together, and then there will be no hit on the foreign exchange rate. So they should all talk about quarter-point movements every 2 months or something, and the forex rate will remain stable. One country does it on its own, and you're going to get volatile exchange rates. Now, what Rishi Sunak is relying on is that they will have negative rates of interest for quite 2, 3, 4 years, but they're negative real rates of interest. They're not going to be negative nominal rates of interest. So all that means is that as inflation picks up, so suppose we get inflation towards the middle of next year at 7 or 8%, that will raise nominal bank rate. Central banks say we've got to put interest rates up to get this inflation under control, and it'll go up to 1%, 2%, 3%, the nominal rate. And then you can stop the inflation continuing by not printing more excess money. And so the inflation will come down and the interest rates will be up. It's very rare that we actually ever have positive interest rates. If you look, there's probably a period between 97 and 2006 where there were positive interest rates. Go back to the 70s, you had inflation at nearly 30%. At that time, you had a bank rate which was 14.75%. So it was still negative terms of almost 15%. Interest rates were still negative. So I don't think any central bank is brave enough to sit on a period of time like now when inflation is around 1 or 2% and say, we're going to raise that. But when inflation starts to go up 3, 4, 5, 6%, they're going to say, we've got to put interest rates up. So the nominal rate will get pulled up by the inflation, and then we might get them reversing when the inflation goes out of it. So that's a deception. It's a way of trying to get over this problem and sort of pass the buck to someone else, say it's someone else's fault. So there will be a crash, unfortunately, because as soon as you put up nominal interest rates, that has real effects. Because if you've got a mortgage and your mortgage was originally a nominal rate of 1.5%, it'll now be a nominal rate of 4% or 5%. So it'll hit you as a person with a mortgage, and it will hit lots of people, and that will disturb. Because what you've done is you've distorted markets so much that undistorting them is going to cause problems. And I suppose with the monetarists, Friedman and Hayek had sort of two views about this. Hayek was go for the big bust, get it all over with, and then you recover. Friedman goes, no, let's do it steadily year after year. But of course, politicians lose their nerve if you do that. And it was like back in 2010, we're going to balance our budget in 2014. No, we're not. 2015, no, 2017, no, 2020, oh no, 2025. So you never do it if you try and spread it out over a slow period. Sorry, it's a long answer. I'll shut up and let someone.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, so you mentioned that we shouldn't be taxing wealth. So would that mean you'd get rid of capital gains tax and inheritance tax?
Yeah. That's the easy answer, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. No, I see. I don't see any good that comes out of inheritance tax. If people have made lots of money, become rich, let them pass it on to their children. I have no problems with them doing that. Inheritance tax is a real damage if it's a business you're passing on to the next generation. So I want everyone to become wealthy. I don't want to sort of tax people. Capital gains tax, there isn't much capital gains tax to pay if you've got inflation under control. If you let inflation run wild, then of course capital gains tax becomes something that people are actually fraudulently having money taken away from them because the changes aren't real. They're inflationary changes. And it's like going back to income tax. Sunak at the moment has said we won't raise the tax thresholds for the next few years, which means as inflation pulls up incomes and you go into the next tax thresholds, you pay more tax. It's just a nice cheating way of getting people to pay more tax without actually saying that we're doing it. So yes, in my ideal world, I wouldn't have inheritance tax. And as I say, I don't mind rich people. I think they inspire other people to go, yeah, I'd like to become rich. How did you do that? And I have absolutely no doubt, another article on my blog, that capitalism, free markets actually creates income equality, not inequality. Things like socialism and communism are what create inequalities. Capitalism creates equality, and the evidence is there, but we don't like to sort of recognize that because we think, no, governments can do all this. They can create equality. They can't. Capitalism can do that for you. Free markets can do that for you.
Okay, thank you. Adam, you've got a comeback.
Yeah, not so much a comeback, but we agree the crash will be inevitable. It will come. But on the backside of that, they just do exactly the same thing again. They continue with credit expansion to stimulate the economy, so that we have all of the growth figures, but they're just like misallocated resources and whatnot, and we just go back into this other next cycle of credit expansion. And that ties into what you just said about inequality as well, because there's certain groups in the economy that are getting this extra liquidity. So the first receivers of the money have additional purchasing power, and they're at an advantage to the later receivers of it. So we just continue in this perpetual cycle, and there's this cynicism of this is capitalism and this is what it does, when That's not what capitalism is. So how do we get away from that?
Right, it's not capitalism, it's crony capitalism that you're talking about. And you're quite right, it will keep happening again and again until someone stands up there and says something about this. Now, this is what a new political party could do, of course, because people are going to get fed up. They're going, this doesn't work, you're doing that. Young people are going to say, look, you're shifting the burden of these things to us. We don't really want this to happen. And, you know, perhaps a party sitting there ready to jump in and go, this is the way forward. You know, we've got the strategy. This is what we need to do. And then you've got to sell it to people. You've got to say that this is the way economies should be managed. And we trust, if you like, markets. We trust capitalism. And what you need to do as a political party is produce that level playing field of stability. And that's where I would go for forcing politicians to balance their budget, so they really tell people, if we want to spend this money, this is where we're going to have to get it from, and not go, now we can put off the day that we pay for this by just sort of borrowing it and then going through the printing process, because borrowing doesn't necessarily lead to printing. Borrowing leads to printing when governments decide that they can't finance the debt, as now, and the Bank of England will be instructed to buy back some debt. And again, you can read all about that. And there's a nice one for you to read if anyone's interested in inflation, because we measure it totally incorrectly. RPI is the best measure, CPI isn't. There's an article where I explain why they took over CPI rather than RPI, what's wrong with it. And you want to get back to real measures, telling people the truth about things, and then you'll start to solve problems.
Telling the truth, that's radical.
It is, isn't it? Yes. That's why no one listens to me. I do really try and get at the truth of all of these things. We've lost Kevin. Has he disappeared? He's collapsed. Somebody said Peter wanted to ask a question.
Oh, I think Ryan wants to ask one first.
Oh, Ryan.
Thank you, Peter. So, I mean, I'm not the greatest person to speak about economics. I know barely anything, but I know a lot of people in my generation think highly of UBI, Universal Basic Income. And well, my question would be, do you think it's a good idea? If I assume your answer is no, how would you persuade someone that it might not be the best idea to come up with in this era?
Good, right. It's not a good idea. You're quite right. It's not a good idea. And there is another alternative, which is the best alternative. And you can read this one on my blog. It's reverse income tax. Because what do you want? You want to protect people who are poor and low of income. And you can do that through reverse income tax. Universal basic income is great for voters because you say everyone gets this. Whereas reverse income tax just helps the people that really need the help. And with reverse income tax, the reason it won't happen is because it gets rid of the welfare state almost. It says to people, here's the money that you haven't earned, and it gives you just those people. I'll tell you very quickly how it works. Suppose you start paying tax at £20,000. For every pound you don't earn, you get 50p. So if you earn absolutely nothing, you get £10,000. If you earn £5,000, you then only get 15,000 50p's. So you will only ever get a proportion of the £20,000, but everyone's entitled to that, but only those people who need it get it. So you could think of it as being a pension. It could be a state pension, because if you're not working, you can claim this. It could be a student grant, because as a student, you can claim this if you're not working, and so on. It's very efficient because it requires only a tax system to run it. Nobody has incentive to cheat on this system, because you can always be better off if you just do a little work and claim the reverse income tax. Whereas you do find yourselves in a position now where if you take welfare benefits, you're actually discouraged from doing any work because you lose £1 for every pound you earn. In other words, the implied tax rate for you is 100% or more. So if you want, the answer is we agree we need something that protects poor people and people with no incomes. That is reverse income tax. It is not universal basic income. Universal basic income, the universal words, the giveaway here. It's great for vote because everyone can have this. No, they can't. Only those people who need it can have it, and reverse income tax identifies those people who need it. So if you read about that one, I think it's under a picture of my family sitting with John Lennon in Cuba, as in John Lennon's statue in Cuba, and it says, "Imagine a reverse income tax." You remember "Imagine" by John Lennon, I trust. So yeah, I'm
Thank
getting
you.
TBI.
All right. Okay. Sorry,
Are
I
you
got
back, Kevin?
cut off. My internet went down.
Oh right, yeah. We can't see you, but you're
So
back.
I got cut off from that.
Yeah.
I'm actually on my mobile. I'm hotspotting from my mobile at the moment because my internet wouldn't restart.
Right.
Is there any more questions, or are we okay to say? Hold on, I think I've got. Is that Evelyn's got a question? Yeah, right. We'll make this the last one,
Hi.
and then
Hi.
we'll call it a night after Evelyn's question.
Yeah, far away.
Yeah, that was all very interesting. I just like to put a bit of a layer around what you said.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking outside the box in the sense of the globalists and what they want,
Yeah.
and how they've infiltrated globally every nation.
Yeah.
So for me, just my take on this, climate change is a big one.
Yeah.
So they're using, I won't say all the other things they use, but climate change is a good example. We're all caught in this climate change, to me, nonsense, because, you know, really the game is control. So how do we survive this? Is it possible? Is there enough people understanding what the globalists are playing at, and how can you and your ideas and what we're talking survive?
Yeah, I mean,
That's it.
yeah, good question. Again, on the blog, there's a little article called Pandemic 2020 Look Back in Anger, where I explain what things are going to be like into the future and the big mistake. I'm against a lot of the things that have gone on under this sort of global attempt to control people. There are certain things that are international. Climate change is something that is international. And so I not only want governments to deal with domestic economies, we do need a sort of international body that is respected to try and look at issues with regard to climate change. And again, it needs to be experts of all opinion discussing and sorting things out, not like a sage committee that says, we are the experts, shut up all you other experts, we'll do what we say. You don't want that. But, you know, something like the rainforest, shall we say, the Amazon rainforest, if we think that the Amazon rainforest is very important to provide air and for the planet, then it's a good thing to say, well, we need to provide Brazil with money for every tree they don't cut down, and sort of almost an international income tax, which goes around the world and deals with these sort of problems. So there are international problems which I think would be better dealt with through an international body, not individual countries saying, no, we're going to do all these wonderful things, as Boris does, and no one else takes any notice. We take a hit and no one else does. So, yeah, I'm against, because I'm for capitalism, I'm against government controls, except in a very minimal way. So I set out, again, in my work, exactly what government should do, what they shouldn't do. And I would own, they're spending about 45 to 50% of your national income now. I'd have them down at less than 25% and limit them. And internationally, I would have international courts, and I would have an international setup which could deal with international problems, which are often those associated with pollution, plastic, and climate change. But we need a good debate about it, because I'm not convinced climate change is as bad as people say. And as an economist, I like everything to be costed and benefited. And if there are very low costs and big benefits, go for it. If there are very high costs and hardly any benefits, don't do it. If that
Thank
helps.
you. I'm sorry to put the spanner in the works, but let's just talk about COVID, and that's a global thing. We all know how it started, or we all think we know. So here we are being controlled. So I'm talking about this type of control, which all the Bilderbergers, etc. We all know who it is. So we're all in these masks, and then we're told really the masks don't work. It's just how will nation states fight this? And I hear what you just said, and that's really good. The idea that we'll have these courts, but the problem we all have, or I have, looking at it, is the corruption is overwhelming. And there are such rich and powerful, and I won't go on because there's a lot more I could say. So it's nice to hear. It's nice to see a lot of young people here really interested, and what I'm hearing I really like. But thank you for what you said, and I'm always putting a spanner in, but never mind.
That's fine, because if you want to push me on that one, that would have to be another talk. But I'm all for herd immunity. I'm all for having the Coronavirus Act repealed. I'm all for having no lockdowns. I put an idea forward for 2 weeks of lockdowns back last March, where they could get out and fill all the potholes in the road, because I cycle quite a lot, and that's it. But no, I don't see that there's any need for lockdowns. I see a system where, and it's quite easy because people receive shielding letters if they're vulnerable. No one else is vulnerable, but there are some people, they receive a shielding letter. Person who receives a shielding letter should be able to access furlough. So they go to their employer and say, I've got a shielding letter here. And the employer says, do you want to carry on working? And it's your risk, yes or no. If it's no, you get furlough. In that way, you end up with a very small amount of money wasted on furlough. Whereas what have you got? And you don't really realise this. We've been paying £14 billion a month into furlough for people to produce nothing. And then Boris stands up and he goes, we're going to build back Britain better. We want infrastructure spending, and we want this, and we want this. And you say, how much money have you allocated to this? And he says, £1 billion. And you, what, £1 billion a year? And he goes, no, over the next 10 years. We're putting £14 billion a month into furlough, and they're talking about build back better by spending £1 billion, most of which has been allocated high-speed rail network. We do need people just to listen and ask questions. I mean, one of the questions that I keep asking on Twitter, and it does sort of get quite a lot of traction, is if you read the deaths every day from COVID, and they say within 28 days, but if you read that line, it says deaths for any reason in the last 28 days. And you cannot get the BBC to say for any reason, because people will go, what does this mean for any reason? And then you go, well, these are people who just tested positive. They didn't actually die of COVID, but we record them as COVID deaths, because that doesn't frighten you as much when sort of 99% is survived COVID without any problem. I think I put a tweet on today and I said something about the long COVID syndrome, because they're all talking about it today to keep us frightened. With the long COVID syndrome, is it the same symptoms as long lockdown syndrome? Because I'm sure people in lockdown have all these symptoms that they say, no, they're long COVID symptoms, and I'm sure they're not, they're long lockdown. I won't carry on. That's another time I'll do that one.
All right. Thank you very much, John.
A pleasure.
I hope everybody found this very entertaining and educational. I did. I always like learning new stuff. I'd like to thank you all for coming this week. Our next session is April the 15th. And I'll be sending out invites, assuming I don't forget. Sorry, where is Adam? He's gone. Sorry, Adam, if I forgot your invite. Oh, there you are. You're on the list now, so don't worry. So I'll be sending out the invites for the next one. If there's any questions that you've like to ask but forgotten, send them to me via email, and I'll get them to John, and maybe he'll send an email back with an answer.
Yeah, we'll do. And
Thank you very much.
I'll send you the slides over. Thank you, everybody. Enjoyed talking.
Yes, thank you. Cheers.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.